Thanks for pulling us together again. I want to thank you for calling this hearing on the ongoing surge of Central American migration that we're experiencing on our southwest border. It's an important challenge for the region and for our country as well. I think it's a moral challenge. I look forward to continue to work together with the chairman, the rest of our delegation toward lasting solutions. I look forward to joining him and several of our colleagues. I think Senator Peters, maybe Senator Heitkamp, and maybe a House member or two to go down to several of these countries, including, I believe, Guatemala and Honduras later this month. But last spring, as the chairman has said, we were shocked by the flood of migrants arriving across our borders from Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, particularly the thousands of unaccompanied children and families with young kids. When they arrived, most did not try to evade our Border Patrol agency. Instead, they sought them out for protection. Some of their stories and those of the migrants who did not survive the journey are frankly heartbreaking. Our government took emergency steps to shelter and process these individuals, but also to put into place strategies to stem the flow. These included public information campaigns on the dangers of the journey, expedited court hearings, and an increased focus on human smuggling and trafficking rings, and support for Mexico's efforts to better police its own southern border. I was pleased that these efforts had an impact, I think we all were, for a time in slowing migration. But many observers warned that as long as the Northern Triangle countries remain mired in violence and poverty, that migration would continue. And that's exactly what appears to have happened. And this time we should not be surprised. Although for a number of months, significantly fewer Central Americans were apprehended at our southern borders, the flow never really stopped. In fact, much of the decrease was due not to fewer people fleeing the Northern Triangle countries, but from the unprecedented new enforcement efforts by Mexico, which we encouraged on its southern border with Guatemala. Between July 2014 and June 2015, for example, Mexico reportedly apprehended nearly 157,000 Central American migrants. That's a 70% increase compared to the same period for the previous year. But since the summer, even this enhanced effort on part of our Mexican partners has not been enough. Border Patrol apprehensions of Central American children and families began slowly climbing toward last year's levels earlier in 2015. In August, they surpassed the number of new arrivals in 2014. In September, arrivals have remained relatively high as well. I think this is particularly striking, given that apprehensions usually peak in the spring, they decline over the summer and early fall. There are different theories as to why we're seeing more Central American migrants again, particularly children and families. Some people point to increased violence in Salvador, others to drought conditions that have worsened poverty for many in the region. Still another theory is that the smugglers have found new routes that have allowed them to get around Mexico's enhanced apprehension efforts and our own. Of course, there are also pull factors, and they've been alluded to already, particularly the desire on the part of migrants to reunite with family members who are already here. Smugglers may also be marketing real or perceived changes in our immigration policies, such as current litigation, calling into question family detention to persuade migrants that now is the right time to make this trip. We're going to discuss today some of these factors and also what we can do to try to change the dynamic. I think the increased apprehension we're seeing this summer and fall are important reminders that we must, in addition to ongoing efforts to better secure our borders, work with our partners to address the root causes of Central American migration. The governments of Guatemala, of Honduras, El Salvador have joined in an unprecedented regional agreement, as we know, called the Alliance for Prosperity. It seeks to change the underlying conditions on the ground that compel so many people to flee. Our own government has proposed a $1 billion investment in foreign aid in the current fiscal year for initiatives to complement the Alliance for Prosperity. These funds are intended not only to improve security, but also to provide more economic opportunity for the citizens of the Northern Triangle and improve the rule of law in the region. I like to say the focus of these investments largely is to create a more nurturing environment for job creation and job preservation, mostly job creation, in El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, which is a key part of what needs to be done. This is a clearly daunting undertaking that will not yield immediate results. Yet we cannot continue to neglect the underlying conditions that have led to current migration crisis. It's also worth remembering that is our appetite for drugs. And the chairman's already mentioned this. It's worth mentioning again. It is our appetite for drugs that fuels much of the violence and corruption in this region. As a result, I believe we have a moral obligation to try and help to undo that damage. The United States of America is complicit in creating a situation in El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala where people want to flee. They want to get out of there. And for us to say, helping to create a situation which is unbearable for you, intolerable. We wouldn't want to live there. We wouldn't want to raise our kids there. We're going to be complicit in creating that situation. And then when you try to get out and escape, we're going to make sure you don't come to our country. That's a moral dilemma, and the one that I'm not comfortable with. I suspect none of us are. But several of us on the committee, as I said, are going to be traveling to the Northern Triangle in a couple of weeks, explore more fully what's fueling this ongoing migration, how U.S. engagement in the region might help turn the tide. I think our efforts and those of others working on this issue are very much in keeping with the valuable message that Pope Francis delivered here just a couple of weeks ago during his visit. And we need to see these migrants as people, not simply as numbers, and in partnership to try to alleviate the desperate conditions that cause so many to risk life and limb to flee the U.S. And to remember, we have a moral obligation to, and I'm not preaching, but maybe I am, I'm preaching to the choir. We have a moral obligation to, I think, to put ourselves in their shoes. How would we want to be treated, and to act accordingly? I really want to thank each of you for what you do with your lives, and for spending part of your lives with us today, and testifying and responding to our questions. Bishop Seitz, you're a dead ringer for my first cousin, Dan Patton, who was a lay minister in a church in Columbus, Ohio. And I've never seen him wear a collar like this. But I walked in, I looked at you, and I said, what is my cousin doing here? But he would probably say to what you said, amen. And I do too. I want to listen to y'all testify this morning. I was reminded of something that Winston Churchill once said, and I don't know if Senator Caskell and others recall this, but he once said, if you're young and not liberal, you don't have a heart. If you're old and not conservative, you don't have a brain. And what we need to do in addressing this dilemma, moral dilemma and human dilemma, is we need to act with our hearts and with our brains. And there are a number of things that we need to do. And some of them we need to do, I think, all at once. There is the idea of us, great analogy you used, Bishop, about, I think you were the one who said, you know, the firemen show up at the house, lock everybody inside and leave. That's pretty close to what we've done. We've contributed enormously to the misery of the folks who live in these three countries. And then to walk away and say, well, don't try to get into our country, that is just morally wrong. I believe that you've outlined for us very nicely ways that we can act with our hearts and with our brains. One, to deter the likelihood, reduce the likelihood that people are going to come, one, by making it clear that it's going to be hard to get into our country, and if you do, you may not get a chance to stay. But secondly, to say to these people, the folks who live there, you're going to have a better future, and you're going to have some economic hope, and not have to live in the kind of misery that you face today. We need to do both, and we can. Harry Truman used to say the only thing that's new in the world is a history we forgot or never learned. And actually, I think we learned something from Colombia, where about 20 years ago, a bunch of gunmen rounded up the entire Supreme Court of the country of Colombia, took them into a room and shot them to death. Shot them to death. And today, that country is regarded as a reasonably strong, sound, vibrant democracy. We helped them do it with something called Plan Colombia. And it's not something that we did by ourselves. It's not something they did entirely by themselves, but there are a number of other folks with shared responsibility. We did our part, others did their part, Colombians did their part. What lessons are there for us today from Plan Colombia? I like to say, find out what works, do more of that. What do we learn from Plan Colombia that may be transferable and usable here in this situation? Anyone? And just be brief, please. Yes.
Thank you,
Mr.
Senator.
Casas Zamora.
That's me, hailing from Central America.
Where? Adonde?
Costa Rica.
Okay, great place.
Thanks. Glad to hear that. I think the single most important lesson that one can draw from Plan Colombia and similar experiences is that unless there's real serious buy-in from the political elite in the country, very little of this will have any success. I mean, the lion's share of transforming these countries, of reforming and establishing real structures of rule of law and accountability really falls on the shoulders of those countries. I mean, unless they get serious about that, no amount of foreign assistance will do the trick.
Yes, Bishop Science.
I might also suggest we could learn a lot from Nicaragua. It's very interesting that when you look to the region, you realize that so many of those who are fleeing the Northern Triangle are going to the border countries also. They're not just...
It's not, that's right, they're not just coming here.
They've seen increases of something like 1,200% in the last, I don't know, 6, 8 years.
It's a lot easier to get into those countries than into this one.
Yes. They're going wherever they can go, fleeing the burning house, if you will. Some of the things that happened there, when new government entered in, they turned over the police force, and they established means of community policing. They increased the pay of the police and so on to avoid situations where they could be easily corrupted. Nicaragua is a poorer country than even these countries that we're speaking about, but it's much safer. Not without its problems, but in most of the country is much safer. We could learn a lot from them.
All right. Let's talk a little bit about the Alliance for Prosperity that the Central American countries have launched, that our administration has proposed that we fund to the tune of about $1 billion. And I think there's some money in the appropriations bill in the Senate that would, I think, fund maybe not $1 billion, but maybe $600 million to do. What are some things that money should be spent on to help address some of the root causes that we're talking about here today? Where should it be? Where might it be well spent? Because I'm not interested in wasting money. I know neither of you are either. Mr. Duncan would.
Yeah, and it's kind of in response to your previous question. If you look at what the aid is going to Mexico right now through the Merida initiative, there's all the traditional stuff, sort of, aiding the military, law enforcement agencies, etc. But one of the most interesting aspects is actually the concept of building resilient communities. And this is working with government at the 3 levels, federal, state, local, working with the private sector, working with civil society to really try to help communities to bounce back after violence has broken out. And I would say that some of these community-based approaches at the local level really do provide an opportunity not to stop the violence, but really once a community or a nation has taken the decision to act upon it, to help them recover. So I would say that community-based approaches are going to be crucial in improving conditions.
Thank you. Others, please. Kevin.
Thank you, Senator. I have no doubt that helping rebuild law enforcement institutions in these countries should be one of the priorities of the alliance. It should not be only that, but that has to be at the center. And my impression is that foreign assistance in this field can only hope to bring about visible changes if it picks few urgent institutional programs that can have a catalytic effect in the transformation of the image and the efficacy of law enforcement bodies. Things like improving internal control and anti-corruption units within law enforcement bodies. Adopting modern information technologies, and that means from regular victimization surveys to the kind of the CompStat kind of system for data gathering. And to have those information technologies and adopt them as part of the policymaking process, creating vetted units to handle complex multinational investigations, improving investigation and prosecutorial capacities with regards to complex financial crimes, and support CC.
Tell folks what CC is.
Is the UN-sponsored International Commission Against Impunity in Guatemala that, on balance, has been extraordinarily successful.
Good, thanks. Mr. Chairman, this is a timely hearing, given the codel that we're going to lead to several of these countries in a couple of weeks. I've been down there any number of times, as you know, and my sense is there's a sort of like a public uprising that's occurring in some of these countries that led in part to the incarceration of the president of Guatemala. I'll close with just a real quick story. I remember visiting down there a couple of years ago. We're down in Guatemala. We're meeting with the president of the country, and I said to him, "Mr. President, do you realize that you have in your prisons, you have like the guards are actually providing cell phones to the inmates so they can continue their illicit criminal business?" And he said, "Really?" And I said, "And did you know that there is technology that would enable those cell phones not to be usable in prisons?" And he said, "Really?" And I said, "And did you know that you have that technology installed in a number of your prisons?" He said, "Really?" And I said, "And did you know you don't use it?" And he said, "Really?" And I said, "And do you know the guy, the interior minister of the country, sitting next to me?" And I said, "Do you know the guy that's in charge of this? He's your interior minister." And he said, "Really?" Well, that president's in jail today. He's in prison today. I'm going to see if I can reach him on the phone later. But the people down there are fed up. And some of them are voting with their feet to try to get out. Others are voting with their teeth to try to create a situation where people like the president are arrested and put where they belong in jail. Thank you.